Hello, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, wherever you are around the world. Thanks for joining today's webinar from Real Story Group on a topic that's near and dear to our hearts and the foundation of our company, the right way to select web content management technology. This is something we've been advising customers on since Tony founded this company 22 years ago, and we're excited to give you the latest and greatest tips for how to select the right vendor for your particular need. So as you can see, Tony Byrne, our founder and CEO, is here to take us through most of today's presentation. My name is Scott Dill. I'm on the business development team here with Real Story Group, and happy to have so many of you join us today. Just a couple of things I wanted to mention as we get started. We will have time at the end for questions, so if you do have anything you want to add, feedback, questions, anecdotes, you can enter those into the questions tab and you go to webinar control panel. And then you'll also be able to access the slides from today's presentation. Those are typically available by the end of the week, so keep an eye out on our website for those. For those of you who are new to Real Story Group, just a quick little background about us. As I mentioned, we've been doing this for over 20 years now, and we've really taken a different approach to how we work with technology vendors. And that approach is that we don't work with technology vendors in any way, shape, or form. So we don't speak at their conferences or write white papers for them. What that allows us to do is provide you the real story behind what these vendors do well, but sometimes more importantly, what they don't do so well and where they might fall short for you. So what Tony's going to do today is walk you through how to really cut through their marketing hype and make sure that you're selecting the web content management solution that makes the most sense for your organization. So with that, I'll turn things over to Tony.
Great, thanks, Scott. As some of you know, we start out life as CMS Watch. And so on our famous subway map, that's the light blue line here, which has been on our subway map ever since 2008, which is another way of saying this is a very, very mature marketplace, right? WCM tools have been around for more than 25 years, but it's always interesting to watch them evolve. And what's particularly interesting to us is that we see a number of our subscribers and council members really thinking about switching vendors. They may be on a first or second generation platform and really wondering, is this the right solution for us, or sometimes hitting some roadblocks of a variety that you would recognize. And that's why this map is kind of important, because we really need to see WCM kind of in the broader context of what are some of the other content and marketing technologies that revolve around WCM, or maybe WCM revolves around them, certainly intersects with them. Both from a vendor standpoint, which you see here, but also from a technology standpoint. And that's going to be one of the key themes today as we set up what's the right way to select, which is really part of it is going to be understanding where WCM fits in your broader stack. So, we've been watching this for me personally for 25 years, with RSG for the past 22 years. And it's really been kind of an evolving problem set. So I'll go through a little bit of history here. First, when we started out in the early 2000s, the notion was that the CMS, as we called it then, your Web CMS, was kind of at the center of your stack. And this was the reference model actually that we had. And even then, it was a multi-channel reference model. The dream was that your CMS could feed out to all kinds of different external consumption environments. And some people did this maybe a little bit better than others. That was always sort of part of the dream. I think what changed then in the 2010s was, this sort of multi-channel thing became not just an aspiration, but a reality. And that in fact, multi-channel was not just publishing content, but multiple engagement channels. So you had at the top, of course, you had social, email, web, mobile, print, and video, and then various production and interaction delivery services, and then content and engagement management, where you had social engagement, suddenly marketing automation, email channel, and then digital and asset management kind of entered the scene. And so this was the reference model that we had for the 2010s. And ideally there was some sort of customer data backbone underneath it, As most of you know, backbone is maybe a somewhat generous term for it. It was more like customer data spaghetti. But in any case, this was the model. And what most of us did from the 2010s up until, I would say, 2020, and many still today, is to really focus on modernizing these 4 kind of engagement channels, including web content management, maybe above all, investing a lot of money into creating dynamic, interactive, sophisticated experiences, building major teams to do this, investing a lot of money in technology and operations to get there. The problem was that what ended up happening is that we were engaging with our various customers and prospects in silos. And so we had this silo problem where we had all these different engagement silos, each of which typically had their own sort of caboose of content, data, rules, planning, and analytics. And I think many of us are still suffering from this today. And so the challenge that we have going forward in the 2030s is, how to align all of this. And our general thesis that we've had for at least 3 years now is that where this is going is really an investment kind of in your core rather than your externals, which is delivering some foundation services around omni-channel operations, unified customer data, omni-channel content, and others. And so what this means is getting a little bit lighter and agile towards the edge or the actual engagement layer, and then really making sure that you've got a strong foundation layer across these different capabilities. And so this takes us to a reference model that we've been evolving really for the past 3 years around this notion of a composable stack. There's a lot to say about this. This is a generic reference model, so it's really more kind of aspirational rather than a descriptive of to be in most environments. But the key thing here, if you compare it with our model for the 2010s, is of course this dramatic expansion, both kind of vertically and horizontally across the whole MarTech problem domain. And so this is really then the issue for you, because suddenly a marketing and communications and engagement expert has to, or leader has to kind of understand and interweave all of these things, which leads obviously to a lot of complexity. But one of the things that's worth noting here is WCM has gone from kind of the center of that reference model to just one sort of green block over here where you see WCM at about 3 o'clock. And so that doesn't mean that web content management is unimportant, because it's still critically important, right? Your website and some of your web apps need the right content. But what's happened is, relative to the other investments and things you have to be doing, it has declined, right? So it's declined in relative terms, not in absolute terms. It's important. And that's really critical, because we don't think that the marketplace has necessarily kept up with that. And moreover, it's really essential as you think about what's the right WCM tool for you going forward in 2023 and beyond, is yes, about its innate capabilities as a WCM platform, but also how does it fit into this broader stack? And in particular, we believe you have a greater risk of overbuying rather than underbuying in this sort of environment. And I think as we all think about this omni-channel world, and personalization is really driving this as well, we see a lot of content energy going into what we call an omni-channel content platform. Again, this is aspirational. We know few organizations that are really doing this well right now. But this is a spin-off, not from the WCM marketplace, but from the DAM marketplace, which is really interesting. And this idea that I can have a reusable and trackable and derivable set of assets and data and content at a component level that can be redeployed across dynamic and personalized experience all over my whole engagement and interaction, that whole panoply of environments there. And so this also maybe should have you thinking about, to the extent that your WCM platform in almost every case can't do this, maybe you ought to be narrowing the scope of what you include under WCM, right? And I say this because many analyst firms will tell you the opposite, and many WCM vendors will tell you the opposite, that you ought to double down on your investments in WCM and make it the center of your content universe. And that is setting you up for the 2010s. It's not setting you up for the 2020s. Okay, so I'll get off the soapbox a little bit there and talk a little bit about the marketplace, and we'll dive into how do you select these tools. So for the last 10 years, we have kind of defined the WCM marketplace as a mature marketplace. And by mature marketplace, we mean that most technology marketplaces, when they mature, fall out on kind of a complexity spectrum, right? Is that you have super complex toolkits on one end, and then you have more productized solutions on the others. What's really happened is the whole bottom of the market has fallen out for these sort of website builders like Squarespace and others. So there really isn't anything heavily productized. You have these mid-range platforms, which are still platforms and still developer intensive on one end, and then toolkits on the other end. We're not making a value judgment here. You just need to understand that one end is going to give you more richness, more extensibility, but is also you're going to suffer from complexity, developer intensity, and definitely long-term total cost. So what's happened in this marketplace, particularly if we look at things that have happened in the last year, is that Adobe's kind of like the last toolkit standing. And even then, we see a lot of backlash against Adobe. It tends not to be a WCM platform that you select from new in a really competitive standpoint. It tends to be sort of something that you've inherited and kind of had to deal with. To be sure, it's not as legacy as SDL or IBM or OpenText and others, but I think if we think about the narrowing scope of WCM, I think there's an emerging consensus that Adobe is probably overkill. The upper range platforms is where there's a lot of activity now, and the mid-range provides a reasonable set of alternatives, some better than others, for where you might want to go going forward. The key thing here is the market is still highly fragmented. We still see a lot more platform as a service rather than multi-tenant software as a service. I think a lot of this has to do with just the complexity of what's going on here. Still a lot of significant competition around usability and the implied editorial models, and that's why the particular methodology that we're going to recommend here is going forward towards the end of this half hour is very much based on test-based. There's a lot of competition on architecture, particularly headless versus non-headless or headful or whatever you want to describe it. We think that has been largely that debate has been largely solved, and that what most large enterprises in particular want head optional. That is, in other words, hybrid headless. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The other thing that has happened, particularly in the last 5 years, and we see some vendors doubling down on this then, is that the market squeeze on some of the higher end players has led them to expand into adjacent spaces, particularly by acquiring different vendors. Certainly that has been the way that Sitecore has sort of defined itself here. What you'll notice here, which is very interesting, is that we moved Sitecore from the toolkit down to mid-range with the advent of their XM Cloud solution, which is a much more, to be sure, simpler, but also targeted more at the mid-market. So this is more generally with the acquisitions that Sitecore has made, is pushing Sitecore from the high end of the market down to the mid-market, which is really interesting. We have not yet ever seen that be a successful strategy. We'll see how it plays out. But it's just sort of pointing out some of the ferment that's going on in this whole market. But what this does mean, again, if you think about this in connection with the arguments that I was kind of laying down earlier, is you have an opportunity to get simpler at the engagement tier. So don't just look at these large sort of vendors with great market share. I'll say more mind share than market share. Really consider simpler solutions to them, and never just look at the high end. So whenever we're helping one of our subscribers build a shortlist, we're always asking them, is there a simpler solution that will still suffice for you? Because again, you have a greater risk of overbuying than underbuying. And again, I think that the headless, non-headless debate has been largely resolved. If you're a large enterprise, you need both. And so the headless solutions only, which tend to have kind of a religious adherence to that architecture, are coming up short for some larger enterprises that also need more head-full solutions. And so we really think that you ought to make a careful look at your use cases and not just default to headless, which traditionally has been kind of a technology sale, which is vendors selling to engineers as opposed to vendors selling to marketers and editors, and you don't want it to be one or the other. In other words, you don't want the Adobes of this world just selling to marketers. On the other hand, you don't want the Contentfuls of this world and content stacks just selling to engineers. Those two have to really get aligned, and when they do, typically the enterprise finds that it really needs a hybrid solution that can support both headless as well as more coupled solutions. Okay, so now let's get to the meat of this. And once again, I'll remind you that you can ask questions at any time. And I know we've got one coming in right now. Any questions that you might have, any comments that you have, any vignettes that you'd like to share with your colleagues, we're definitely going to have time for that. Okay, so how do you select? So the first thing is, this is an area where you really want to leave behind any kind of legacy waterfall type approaches where you spend a lot of time trying to build the perfect requirements in Excel and then not enough time actually engaging with the vendors in a hands-on way. So we recommend a more design thinking approach. My colleague Jared and I wrote a book about this that you can find published by Rosenfeld Media, The Right Way to Select Technology. It's a more design thinking approach, which means that it's business focused, it's team-based, and critically, it's empirical. It's also iterative, so you sort of narrow down, almost like dating. You have a series of dates before you move in together and then get married, right? And so this allows you to be adaptive, because we know after doing this for the last 25 years, nobody gets their requirements perfect. And even if you've already been using a WCM platform for a decade or more, you're not always going to be 100% accurate until the reality actually hits the keyboard. And so it's a very test-oriented type process. So let me tell you about how it works. First thing, you want to create diverse user stories, right? And you're looking again at a market of maybe 30 vendors. Then once you create those user stories and you define some of your other requirements, this typically can build you down into an environment of about 5 to 8 vendors. So at this point, you want to create some sort of RFI, RFP. We sometimes do a combined request for proposal and demos. And then use the proposals and demos to sort of ideate, right? In other words, you're going to learn a lot from the proposal. You're going to learn a lot from the demos, and not just pick then. If anything, that should just give you more visibility into a more inquiry-oriented process where you have a lot of questions that are going to come out of that. And that's why we recommend a 2-vendor hands-on bake-off. And if there are still outstanding technical issues, you can always do a 1-vendor POC with the finalist. So that's typically where they actually launch in your environment. You sign data protection agreements, and it's more complicated. We typically see that more in the CDP or customer data platform environment, but there's times when you need to do it for WCM. I mean, certainly when we've worked with high volume media companies, this kind of was their product, so they wanted to put it through its paces from a security and performance and reliability testing, even though one of them had won sort of the usability test during the bake-off. Okay, so let's start at the beginning here. When you're building a long list or a short list, don't be mystical, right? Like what you see in analyst quadrants is typically what the market looked like 5 years ago, and typically overweighted towards large vendors who have very good analyst relations. So you're welcome to try out our Real Quadrant shortlist generator. You do have to be a subscriber to get all the goodies, but it sort of should help you understand that there's a better way of coming up with the right fit rather than just generically looking at the mystical quadrant or the mystical wave. The other thing you want to do is, for the most part, put your spreadsheets away and build testable narratives. We have a particular model around this that we find very successful for web content management, where you have an editorial use case, a marketing use case, maybe a developer use case, sometimes a UX use case, where all the key personas who are part of your selection team, and by the way, you want a multidisciplinary selection team, are part of the process, and that you're not just sort of listing a set of jobs to be done or wish list requirements, but that you're actually creating a more human-centered narrative about how you would like this to work in the future. So these are to-be essentially scenarios. Then, as I said, never skip a bake-off. It dumbfounds me how often large enterprises will select technology after a demo round. This is like buying a car after watching the automobile salesperson drive it around in the parking lot. You need to get in the car and drive it. In fact, multiple different people may need to get in this car and drive it. So you want to make this as faithful as possible. You're only limited by your time and resources. We often find this can be done in in a single week, but you definitely want to do it with 2 finalists. You want to set this up as a competitive process. And by the way, you'll probably get much better terms and financial and legal terms, SLAs and things like that out of this whole process as well. Okay, so let's wrap up with what this means for you, and then we'll take some questions from there. And incidentally, there's a whole number of things that I didn't mention here that are more sort of generic technology selection issues that and things to do that don't necessarily relate to web content and experience management. Things like, of course, you need to have a sponsor. Of course, you need to have some sort of charter and vision about what are the business objectives that you're doing, and use those as your evaluation criteria. Of course, you need a business chair who's part of your multidisciplinary selection team that includes editors, marketers, developers, potentially systems administration people, the whole span of people who have some interest in here. So there's a lot more to say about that. The book can tell you more, or if you're a Real Story Group subscriber, we can walk you through a much more detailed review of this specific methodology that you can apply across web content management or anything else. But what this means for you from a WCM perspective are really try to encapsulate these in kind of 8 key takeaways. So the WCM marketplace is really remains fragmented. So fragmented is a highfalutin analyst term for there's a hell of a lot of vendors still out there. All of them still kind of rising with the tide, but the marketplace is compressing a little bit. The top is kind of coming off it, and the bottom is kind of coming off it. And so that actually I think is a good thing, that you have potentially more value for your money. You want to remain cautious about headless only. This is an architecture approach, which is really more of a feature rather than a business objective. And you need to note the meta trend around externalization of previously bundled services. So again, maybe that's a little bit too fancily put out there, but the idea is that there are a number of things that relate to what's going to happen on your website that you may not want in a web content management system, that you may want to have, and in fact, large organizations in particular decidedly want to have outside of their WCM. And so bundling them into your WCM is often a mistake, because then it's only available in that channel. Whenever the WCM vendor tells you it's really only available in that channel, that's not maybe the way you want to do it. So things like content operations, A/B testing and optimization, a lot of emphasis there on multi-channel personalization. If you are personalizing content in your web channel and then using a different personalization engine to personalize it in your e-commerce channel, I guarantee you are going to experience some disconnects and some poor customer experiences. Analytics, of course, you never want to bind that to just your WCM. Digital asset management and other component assets, increasingly important with each passing year. Obviously something that you don't want to necessarily bundle with your WCM. And then of course, customer data stores. Your WCM should never, ever, ever be a data store except for the metadata around your content. So we see several traditional WCM vendors, not just Sitecore, trying to become suite vendors. They will likely fail in this, it's a difficult thing to pull off. It's not their problem, but don't make it your problem. You definitely want to apply design thinking to your selection process. So what this means is keep it real, make it story-based, make it human-based, make it based on your requirements and not generic requirements, and iterate and test, and above all, do as much hands-on testing for editors, developers, UX people, content managers, site managers, marketers, whoever the key personas are in your WCM environment. Do as much testing as you need to get comfortable, and push back if any vendor says that you don't need to do that. Now, there is an opportunity here for those of you who are thinking of selecting a new web content management platform, and that is you can get a more modern solution, right? That's more cloud friendly, that can play nicely with the rest of your stack. But the one thing that sometimes has gotten lost, and I think in this era where there's a lot of conversation around headless, is do not forget marketer and editorial usability. If your marketers and editors, authors and managers, that whole panoply of people don't like this platform, they increasingly have ways of escaping it, and at a basic level, you've failed them, right? And so that should be one of the primary things that you're doing. Now, of course, As architects ourselves, we care a lot about the architectural fit within the platform, but let's just say that this is table stakes. Your marketers and editors need to be successful in this platform. They need to, at a minimum, not hate using this platform. And so that needs to be a key part, an essential part of the testing that you do along the way. Okay. So RSG can help you in this process. Really, there's 3 different ways that enterprises engage with us. One is they license our WCM research. In other words, the blue line on this, they get access to the Real Quadrant tool and other tools that we have for decision making. They get all the down and dirty on the different vendors, and then that helps them make a good decision. We're on the call, we're on the phone to help you go through that process. The second offering we have is what we call a full stack subscription, where people subscribe basically to all of our vendors on this map and get access to all of the juicy details on the vendors, but more importantly, they get advice from us about how to build your stack as a whole using some of the reference models that I laid out earlier. And then the third way that some of the organizations that have already signed on to number 2 is here on the lower left, is to join our exclusive council of MarTech leaders. So these are enterprise only, no vendors, people who meet twice a year in person, several times a year virtually, to share very privately how they are solving some of the toughest MarTech and content technology problems. These tend to be large enterprises. We're meeting this May in Chicago. Super excited about that. We're talking a lot about personalization, about customer data platforms, about omni-channel content. It's going to be a great conversation. And so Scott can tell you more about that. And while he's doing that, again, if you have any questions, comments, something you disagree with, something you'd like to add to the conversation, feel free to use the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. So Scott, you want to just talk about next steps, and we'll take a look at the questions that have come up.
Absolutely, yeah, just following up on what Tony said, we do have a few seats left for that Leadership Council meeting in Chicago. So if that's of interest to you, you can email us here at explore@realstorygroup.com. You're always welcome to take a look at samples from any of the research areas we cover. So if you'd like to take a look at the web content management research, you can do so. When if you're interested in getting direct access to Tony and the rest of our analysts here, certainly let's talk to each other about the subscription options that we have and getting access to the research for you and your colleagues within your enterprise. I do see at least one question in the queue, Tony, and maybe a couple others coming in. And if you do have some, let us know. But it looks like Kathy's asking a question for you.
Yeah, can you read that out loud? I seem to have lost that question, Scott, in my panel here.
Yeah, absolutely. So she's asking if you do any specialization for higher education. She's mentioned missing some of the mid-range web content management solutions.
Yeah, higher education is one of 2 vertical sectors where there have been kind of successful spin-offs of vendors, the other one being the media sector. So media and higher education are the exceptions to the rule that web content management is fundamentally what analysts call horizontal or cross-sector. So you're absolutely right, Kathy. There are a number of WCM-specific vendors. There's also a number of media-specific vendors out there. We're aware of a number of them. We've seen them in action. We don't evaluate them because not enough of our subscribers fall into that category. We have worked with higher ed and several media companies and kind of flex to help support them, but they're not part of our overall set of vendors that we include, which are really designed to be, I guess, more globally oriented. But anyway, if you have any other follow-up questions on that, Kathy, you can just contact us. So I see another question from Peter, who's asking about omni-channel content platforms that I mentioned earlier, and would those ultimately replace web content management systems? It's a great question, and people ask us about that. I think the answer is probably no, that they just are. First of all, they're not going to have a superset of all your content. They're just going to have a subset of content that you want to manage at an enterprise level because you want to be able to redeploy it across multiple channels. And to that extent, it's just going to be component content. Not all of your content in the web channel, or for that matter, any other channel, is going to be componentized. You need to manage things like templates, which you may or may not componentize. You need to manage long form content. things like case studies and other things. So there is always a future for web content management systems. It's just that future is probably a little narrower than it was, 5 years ago. So great. Well, with that, we have reached the end of our time, and we do need to break off here. If you have any other questions at all, feel free to use any of these coordinates here to get in touch with us. But once again, love having you here. And so for Scott and I, this is Real Story Group signing off. Have a great rest of your week. Bye now.